Hiya folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things. And there's a new Fallout show coming out shortly, so I thought now would be a great time to make something. I'll start as I always do, sometimes with a block of freshly pressed clay ready to be squeezed into a lumpy gray blob. This gray blob then can be pulled apart until I've got an appropriately sized lump which can be gently reshaped into a slightly lumpy torso. Now, as with most projects, I have an end goal in mind but no idea of how I'm going to get there, so a lot of the steps I take at the start of the process end up getting tossed aside or smooshed away as I change my method of attack. I'll mark out the general muscle of the torso before fitting a head in place and significantly inflating the spine and shoulders. I'll then go back to the head and start the slow and not at all methodical process of making a Deathclaw face. Once I've got the shape of the jawline and the front of the face figured out, I can start to build up the back of the head where the horns will sit. This position is going to change as I build up the features and try to get the sizing correct, but by pressing the horn holes into the side of the head, I can at least imagine what she'll look like with her horns in place. Then I can reshape the snoot so it's a little bit flatter and pop some teeny tiny black eyeballs in place. Some little sausages stuck onto the tops of the eyes will be her big angry eyebrows, and a couple holes poked into the front of her face will give her the means to smell what the rock is cooking. I can then give her a little angry mouth and she kinda looks like a monkey. To fix that, I'll jam some big teeth into the front of her face, leaving the entire tooth exposed so that I can cover the tops of the teeth with little lumps of clay to make her big gummy gums. Some final facial refining of the face will get my face in place, and I can start to thicken up her neck by adding more little lumps of clay and cutting lots of little lines into the surface. Then I'll start working my way down her body, building up the muscle of her shoulders and really highlighting these stringy, muscly muscles of her torso before creating the plated sections of her back. Rolling a little ball stylus back and forth over all these parts will create some natural looking lumpy muscly texture, and I can start to jam some pre-baked spinal spines in place. She'll get a row running straight down the middle of her spine, and I can build up some more lumpy clay bits on the sides to fit some smaller, less impressive spikes in place. Once those spikes are in place, I'll bake her body to save my progress before drilling some holes in her horn holes so I can fit some wound wire in place and bend them into an appropriately horny shape. These get wrapped in a layer of clay that I can reshape and texture into a pair of beautiful Deathclaw horns that will hopefully make my weird monkey fetus look a little bit more menacing. With the horns in place, I can attach a long wormy dealy to the bottom of the torso to create Barbara's tail. Oh yeah, her name is Barbara, or Babs for short. Babs then gets some abs that go all the way down her torso and onto her tail, which then gets a good ball stylus rolling to add lots of wrinkly, fleshy texture. A little lumpy addition to the bottom, and I can bend the tail into its final position before baking the body again and drilling some holes to fit her leg bones in place. A quick bending to get my pose correct, and I can wrap her bones in some more clay, building up the proportions until her legs are appropriately beefy for her body. Babs is going to be floating in an unidentifiable science vat, so I want her to have a semi-fetal position with her legs and arms floating close to her body. I'll poke some big divots into the tip of her feet so I can fit some little toes in place before taking some time to make sure her feet have all the necessary lumps and bumps. Because she's floating in a vat, her whole foot's going to be visible, so I want to make sure it looks good from every angle. I can then poke some more holes into the tips of her toes to fit some big spooky claws in place. Finally, some final texturing of the foot to add lots of little scales, and I can start to work my way up the leg, adding an appropriate amount of anatomically unidentifiable musculature. I don't think it really matters what it looks like, since Babs is a big, spooky, irradiated chameleon experiment gone wrong. All that really matters is both her legs look similar. So once I've got an adequate amount of lumpy texture, it's into the oven to bake again before getting to work adding her arms. Same as the legs, these get posed into position so I can wrap them in an appropriate amount of clay onto which I can start the enlumping process. Much like the lower half, I just want to make sure both sides are the same shape and contain the same amount of semi-random lumps. Babs is all about that upper body life though, so her shoulders are going to get an extra lumpy enlumping with another row of spikes pressed into place. I can then work my way along her arms and shoulders, adding more scales and lumps and spikes as I see fit. Otherwise, once I've enlumped the entirety of her upper half, I can finish off her backside by adding another long flat worm of clay to the top side of her tail that gets the ever-important ball stylus rolly texture, followed by a slew of cuts to make her armored plates that then each get their own individual spike pressed into the center. Once these have been appropriately blended into the tail, I can toss her in the oven for an almost final time before moving on to making her hands. These start as all hands do, as a little ball of clay smooshed into a flat mitten shape into which I can snip some little fingies. Some poking and prodding and pinching and pulling plus the addition of a little thumb will make my hand a little more hand-like, and I can press some pre-baked talons into the tips of the fingers before fitting them onto Babs's handless arm nubs. Some strategically placed bits of clay will fill in the gaps and make the seam seem seamless before adding some final texturing to the top of the hand to match the scaly texture of the toes. Otherwise, it's into the oven one last time, and Babs is finally finished and ready for a coat of a bone white primer. I opted for bone white since Babs's base coat is going to be sort of a beigey brown anyways. I'll start the base coating by blasting Babs with a brownish orange along her chest, belly, and the inside of her arms and legs, as well as highlighting all the seams and gaps in her armor with this same color. I'll then follow this by spraying the remainder of her body with a black, trying to avoid getting too close to the recesses I've sprayed orange, so I'm left with a nice smooth transition between the layers. To give her a bit more color and to really highlight those gaps, I'll highlight those gaps with a bit more color. Specifically, I'll add a nice watery, flowy, fiery yellow, making sure it gets into all the gaps. I'll add some lighter highlights along her chest and abs as well, then using some thin pinks and reds, I'll add some softer, fleshy sections around her nose and mouth. Finally, to clean up the overspill of the yellow highlights, I'll aggressively sponge her body with a black, followed by a lighter gray dry brushing to add some weathering and scuff marks. A slightly more opaque pink can get painted into her nose and along her gum line, and I'll paint her teeth with an initial bone white followed by a brighter white before doing the same to her talons and toes. Once that's dried, I'll give them all a bit of weathering with a thin umber wash. Finally, I'll forget to clear coat her with a varnish, which I'm sure won't come back to bite me later. With that, Babs is looking like an absolute baller, and all I need to do now is make a way for her to float in the resin. To do this, I'll drill a teeny tiny hole in her topmost spinal spike and run a very thin, nearly invisible fishing line through the middle. This should be plenty strong to hold her aloft while the resin cures. Of course, before I do that, I need to make a frame. Fortunately, I've got a bunch of spare Perspex sheets that I bought over a year ago and completely forgot about. Also, they don't contain any Polish, which I found to be a strange thing to include on the label. Now I've measured Babs and she's just under 90mm at her thickest, so I think I can get away with making a mold that's about 95mm squared. Or for my American viewers, just under 3 3/4 freedom units. I've also developed something of a complex as a result of a less than ideal win-to-loss ratio when it comes to working with resin, so I tend to go overboard when it comes to ensuring my molds aren't going to fall apart. At this point, I hot glue the edges, then seal them with silicone to limit the possibility of leaks. Of course, longtime viewers of this channel are probably starting to wonder if maybe this is a bit of tragic foreshadowing. Regardless, I can fit Babs in her perfectly sized square tube and hold her in place with some clamps while I get to work mixing up the resin. I'll start by equipping the necessary safety implements and bringing out my scale so I can accurately measure my 2-part epoxy before remembering that this is mixed by volume and the scale is pointless. Then I can pour in part A followed by part B and give it a good mix. Once it's been mixed, I'll add some blue and green dye, then give it another good mixing. Finally, I can cover Babs in the blue mystery science goo and set that aside for 72 hours so it can cure properly without any issues whatsoever. While that's curing, I can get to work making a metal research box. I've cut a couple foam squares so they fit perfectly over the top of the future resin rectangle, and I cut some thin MDF strips to fit around the edge. A couple beads of hot glue will hold all the pieces together while I smooth out the rougher edges. Finally, I'll fill the gaps with some gap filler and attach a base around the bottom box, which will let me fit a battery pack to the underside so I can add lights later. With that, my boxes are built, so it's time to add some color. I'll start with a white primer, then give the interior walls and floors a metallic finish and the exterior walls a nice Vault-Tec blue base coat. I'll then tape off a section so I can paint some yellow bands on the top box while painting the base of the bottom box yellow as well. I'll also use this same yellow to paint over the Vault-Tec logo that I sketched onto the front of the bottom box before coming back with that original blue on a sponge to make it look weathered and worn, like the paint has started to chip off. Off camera, and because I forgot to record it, I made a whole bunch of clay greeblies to stick to the side of the box and make it look extra 1950s science-y. I'll then attach these to the sticky side of some painter's tape on a spinny wheelie-dealie, then blast them with a half dozen coats of yellow until they're the same color as the trim and the logo. Finally, I'll paint some lights red and some knobs black and some random things silver for a bit of color variation. I thought some extra external tubes would be a good idea, so I'll use a heat gun to bend some acrylic rod 45 degrees, then attach it to a couple yellow greeblies to make a definitely sciencey looking set of tubes that I can attach to the top box. Then it's just a case of attaching my various bits and bobs all willy-nilly all over the surface of both boxes until they look adequately high-tech in a way that people from the 1950s probably thought the future of tech would look. Finally, I'll paint a toothpick silver and cut it into tiny sections that I can then glue into each of the corners to be my bolts. It's all a bit too clean looking though, so I'll start the weathering process by giving the entire surface a watery, blackish, brownish wash, letting it streak and pool as it sees fit. Once that's dried, I'll take some dark brown rusty paint and dab that all over the box, making sure to get a natural, random-looking set of sponge marks on top of everything, before coming back with a slightly lighter shade of rusty paint to dab that over top of the dark spots. Some final black wash in all the bolts and metal bits will add that final layer of grime, and my box is looking adequately beat up for the post-apocalyptic world of Fallout. All I need to do now is poke some holes into the corners of the bottom box so I can fit some LEDs in place. I'm using 2 battery packs because I started soldering my wires together before realizing that these 3-volt batteries aren't strong enough to power 4 LEDs at the same time, and also because my knowledge of wiring involves adding bulbs until the battery dies or batteries until the bulb explodes. Suffice to say, when the lights turn on, it's a small miracle. With the bulbs not burning out though, that's my base build, which means it's time to take Babs out of her cryo chamber. A little aggressive persuasion will free the resin from the mold, and it's looking pretty good. I was perhaps a bit too hasty in removing the mold as it wasn't fully set and it pulled a bit of the resin off the front of Babs' containment vat, and I forgot to remove the fishing line from the wall when I smacked it, and it pulled up the line leaving a big ugly mark in the resin. Neither of these are the fault of a poor resin pour, rather they're just a reminder that I'm an impatient idiot. Also, because I forgot to clear coat Babs, her topmost layer of wash has leached into the resin, causing a slightly unsightly discoloration around her body. Again, that's really just me being me. Fortunately, we can just say the discoloration is the result of old faulty Vault-Tec machinery, and the fishing line, well, I can just Photoshop that out and no one will ever know. Otherwise, atom errors notwithstanding, it's a pretty good result, and all I have to do is put my various pieces together, which, thanks to the smallest amount of planning, fit together beautifully. And with that, we're all done here and onto the glamour shots. As always, a big ol' thank you to the fine folk over on Patreon that make these videos possible, and a special hey how are ya to my newest patrons, Lid Vicious, Colin Brown, Tangent, Micah Too Cool, Randy Eitzman, Dead Night Live, Greta, Mr. Derek, Silius, Dark Beastie, Anguished by Pizza, Lena Lois Lay, Salty Corn 1, Cal Slavens, Zombella, KW, Gigglewitch, Lauren T, Kyle Alsop, Laner Damien, Mikhail Simonovich Croft, Millie Koo Dennis, Glitter Gremlin, Elias B, and Bean8 Glue out of Dragon's Jar. You are the mysterious blue goo that this experiment gone wrong of a channel floats in. That's it. We'll see you next time. Cheers.